we knew that these were contentious issues. But nevertheless, we somehow thought that those were contentious issues and nothing more. Professor Hobsbawm had an unusual reputation at that time. Professor Plum used to refer to him as a little left of Stalin. He had an unusual reputation at that time as a slightly doctrinaire Marxist. But nevertheless, the fact remained that he had this light touch when he dealt with history in its broader area, so we simply thought that whenever the doctrine was talked about, it came from personal jealousies and animosities which are normal to the academic world. The point to remember, though, is that both Hobsbawms, in our memory, existed together. And it's not quite right to dismiss one for the other. Now, the second memory is actually of about 5 to 6 years ago, when he visited India. I think 7 years ago. 7 years ago. I think 2005 or 2004. Huh? Yeah. When he visited India, when I was part of a panel when we were discussing his Age of Extremes and related essays that had come out since then. And there, what I found was a person who was not discussing class at all. There were certain questions which intrigued me about the Age of Extremes, which is, for instance, the way in which somehow the hopeful and passionate way in which he had handled Europe in the first 3 Ages volumes, not so much the third, but certainly the first and second, had suddenly disappeared in the Age of Extremes. Europe had almost become marginal, except as a site of suffering, a site of depression, and somewhere it had lost zest for him. So there were certain questions that were posed to him concerning why this was so. Whether in fact the Europe that had been, after all, in many ways, the focus of his attention for much of his scholarly life, had suddenly become, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but had receded into the margins of his attention. The answers actually were not within the frameworks of rigorous Marxist analysis. They were rather, and there was no attempt here to accommodate much of what we had already come to see as a new Marxism that was beginning to emerge as a consequence of dialogues that were taking place between the New Left, the postmodernists, the doctrinaire Marxists, and others. Professor Hobsbawm was now concerned with the great picture, and he was now concerned with a series of emotional problems concerning the world around him. And one could see that even his reflections on the Age of Extremes by this time had become overladen by this set of problems, rather than a passionate interest in the specific. That passionate interest in the specific had really, and the way in which you organize the specific almost to see how it all works in little boxes. This was certainly a lodestone in the life. I do not see, first and foremost, I don't see one person that we're remembering here, but I see certainly a person who changes over time and adapts. And I see different kinds of history coming out of this particular imagination, this mind. That said, I would also like to point out a couple of other to me, pertinent issues. There is no doubt that in many ways, like many public intellectuals, Professor Hobsbawm was born to live. That is that his memory, his name, and what he wrote was to be read again, and again. And it was meant to both be criticized, it was meant to be eulogized, it was meant to aspire. All these different attributes of a formidable writer and a public intellectual are various attributes that Professor Hobsbawm had. And I do not think after a certain point it is important to either condemn him for ideological choices that he made, because I do not think they were ever non-humanitarian and non-humanist in nature, nor is there any need to ignore the tremendous verve and vitality that he was able to bring to a lot of his work. So I do not think that, as frequently happens, he is to be docketed easily and reduced from the status of a genuinely broad-ranging public intellectual to that of a party apparatchik, or for that matter, simply to the status of an armchair, or at least a table and armchair historian. He was something more. He was certainly a person who was worthy of attention, respect, and the lucidity as well as enormous literary effect of what he wrote is going to stand the test of time. But since he is that, I think at least a couple of points need to be mentioned. In bringing together two memories of Eric Hobsbawm, I wanted actually for perhaps you as an audience to think about his broader work, less in terms of the specific interest that he had in the history of labor, the history of the transition from one system to another, all of which actually marked his work on banditry, his work on laboring men, and other such research pieces that he wrote, and actually to deal with the great ages books which he was responsible for. And I leave Age of Extremes on the side here. I think really, in terms of research input, the works on the 19th and early 20th century are those which require attention. And it is very clear here that these are the work of an enormously mature but changing public intellectual. They were conceived of in a broad scale over some 30 years. The beginning of the work, initial publication of Age of Revolutions, is in the early 60s. The beginning of the work is really when Eric Hobsbawm is nearing, after all, he was born in 1917, so he's in his 30s. And it carries on to 1987, or into the 1980s, when the third of the volumes actually comes out. And he has decided to paint the great canvas. And all specific monographs and others are there, but this great canvas is a perpetual preoccupation for him. And somewhere that great canvas is going to be a focus of attention for anybody who's interested in history, because it is so well written. But in judging that canvas at one level, I think one has to remember that the most distinctive feature of Professor Hobsbawm is that he did not get caught in any one particular set of debates or one particular groups and attempt to pursue that group over 30 years. If you look at the volumes, you will see that the volumes keep on changing. They're changing in terms of their assumptions, they're changing in terms of their range, not just because of the subject that they're dealing with. By the 1980s, there is, when he is essentially dealing with empires, there are certain specificities which he has come to understand are themselves captive to larger questions, not just questions inspired by doctrine, but questions that doctrine itself has led people to think about. So when I was listening to him in the 1970s on class, it was because he was worried about certain edges and certain boundaries that these terms actually were inspiring and which were then being questioned. Hence, in the 1980s, when he would come to Empire, that particular cross-questioning would reflect itself in the books that he wrote. It would be less so for the mid-19th century, and it would be even less so for his earlier work on revolutions, even because those were the product of a different mind and a different discursive atmosphere. The result is that you can continuously learn from these books. They are not time-bound. They were the product of a continuously evolving imagination, which begins with the early reflection on Fabian socialism, which is his PhD, and then proceeds over this long life. But by the way, very interesting, he does not write for most of this life. I mean, his early years are not enormously productive because they're very disturbed and uneven. So the Fabian socialism is only, and the early discussions of Marxist texts or laboring texts are the only things which really come out before the 50s. Because strictly speaking, he is born in, where he is born, in Alexandria, and he's adopted and transferred to Berlin, and then he moves to London, etc., etc. I mean, all of you know the blurb which is there at the beginning of every volume, and that wonderful introduction to one of the volumes. I think it is the second or the third, the third, in which he actually describes the story of his mother and his father, which is absolutely superb. The effect of all these, though, is finally to give you, therefore, a continuous, mature reflection. That is one thing that you cannot, one thing you can never accuse Eric Hobsbawm of being, is being either immature or failing to understand the greater issues of the world around him. Those prerogatives, which were really the prerogatives of persons who became scholars in the so-called golden years of the 60s, when jobs were easy and research was easily done, that he was never privileged to enjoy. And the result was he never played. He enjoyed his jazz, he certainly enjoyed his sport, he enjoyed, but nevertheless he never played with his history. It was never to him what it has become sometimes to the Simon Sharmas and others, something where you allow literary flavor to take over to the point where you consider it part of literature. That particular diversion, which has become a feature of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, Eric Hobsbawm would never permit himself the luxury of. The closest he ever did was probably his work on jazz, when he allowed himself to talk more intensively and extensively of the emotions that were generated and the personalities that were involved. This is one point that I'd like to make. Second point, I think, that I'd also like to make is, all said and done, given that he was born in Vienna, given that he was a European Jew, ultimately, and given that he probably should have, through his family background, imbibed a series of sensibilities about communities which were not made in the structures and sinews of empire in a reasonably ordered and disciplined manner. It is one of the sad factors of his books that he lacks he lacks a particular sympathy with the chaos of the marginal world. He is ultimately an Englishman. This is a strange thing to say given this biography. Given that he was born in Alexandria and that he was brought up in Berlin and that he came to England, when he was reasonable. I mean, I would have said late teens, I think. So the formation has already taken place, but it is through a British perspective and through a British European perspective that in many ways Eric Hobsbawm, and a British European Marxist perspective, that Eric Hobsbawm came to see the world. His verdict on nationalism, especially the nationalisms of Eastern Europe, is brutal. It is not very sympathetic. His sense of what inspires nationalist thought and ideas in other parts of the world is interesting, but it is not informed by a great deal of sympathy. This ultimately is a problem. It is a human problem. Eric Hobsbawm, after all, was geographically, structurally, a person who was to form himself in the United Kingdom. To expect him to reach out, to go beyond this, as well as to do all the things that he did, I think would have been uncalled for. That he was to achieve so much is a remarkable achievement. Thank you.
Thank you, Hari. May I now request Professor Hitendra Patel to make his presentation. Professor Patel. Yes. 20 minutes. Sorry.
Respected Chairperson, Professor Vasudevan, Professor Vijay, Prashad, and dear friends. Honestly speaking, I would have loved to give my time to Professor Vasudevan because he was presenting before us